Miss Prism's relationship with Dr. Chasuble is somewhat of a fantasy as well. After losing baby Jack and her novel, she dedicated her life to reality in order to make up for her mistake. This impacted her relationship with Cecily, as she criticizes her for her fantasies and irresponsible behavior. Despite her dedication to reality, the only happiness Miss Prism finds is beyond it, in her futile relationship with Dr. Chasuble. However, this fantasy, like many of the others in the play, does come to pass, as she and the Doctor embrace as the play comes to a close. Wilde again demonstrates how reality conforms to fantasy as the line between them dissolves, despite the seemingly impossible obstacles.
Plain facts of the case are these. On the morning of the day in question, a day that is forever branded on my memory, I prepared, as usual, to take the baby out in its perambulator. I had also with me a somewhat old but capacious handbag in which I had intended to place the manuscript of a work of fiction that I had written during my few unoccupied hours. In a moment of mental abstraction, for which I never can forgive myself, I deposited the manuscript in the bassinet and placed the baby in the handbag.
It can be difficult to distinguish the line between fantasy and reality. Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest highlights the role fantasy plays in reality and vice versa, but its overarching message tells the audience that reality is more heavily influenced by fantasy. Cecily fantasizes about Ernest based on Jack's descriptions of him, and attempts to project invented qualities onto Algernon. Because Cecily wants to marry a man named Ernest, Algernon decides to become christened as Ernest to make her fantasy a reality. For Jack, Ernest is a fantasy for him to become a new person and act completely differently from his reality, and this attracts the affection of Gwendolen. At the end of the play, Jack finds out his true origins and realizes his name is actually Ernest, and here Jack's fantasy crosses the line into his reality. In Miss Prism's recounting of how she misplaced Jack in a handbag, having confused a baby with a manuscript, she shows how the line between fantasy and reality can oftentimes become blurred. In The Importance of Being Earnest, Oscar Wilde draws a fine line between the fantasy and reality and does not hesitate to cross the boundary. Wilde also crosses boundaries by rebelling against traditional 19th century ideals. The Victorian era prioritized reality over fantasy by implementing rigid moral codes and strict societal expectations.